Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning risk management. Part 2. The Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process has as its main goal to prioritize individual risks. These will have been identified in the risk register. It prioritizes these risks by assessing the probability of occurrence and impact of each of these risks. The outputs of this process you might think would be a qualitative risk analysis. And although you do this analysis, there isn't really a separate output that's identified in the PMBOK guide. Instead, the results of this analysis are used to update primarily the risk register and the risk report. By the time this process is done, the risk register will have the priority for each identified risk, the probability and impact assessment for each risk, and each risk's urgency, category, as well as a watch list of risks that aren't considered high priority, but which you want to keep an eye on to make sure that they don't become a problem. The risk report can now include a list of some of the most important risks that should be highlighted, as well as aggregate summary information about all of the risks as a whole, and organizing those perhaps by category, as well as the summary. In addition, there may be some changes to the assumptions log or to the issue log. As with other risk management planning processes, the inputs to the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process include just about everything. It starts with the risk register, of course, which includes the identified risks that you now need to apply qualitative risk analysis to. The risk management plan will give you the guidelines on how to do this. Your stakeholder register can give you some information about different stakeholders that could be potential risk owners. And some of the assumptions and constraints in your assumption log can affect the priorities of your different risks. Enterprise environmental factors can include different industry studies and published commercial information. And you may also have within your organizational process assets some historical information on previous projects and their risks located in your lessons learned repository. Your list of tools and techniques starts, as always, with expert judgment, because you may be able to find some people who have experience on previous similar projects or who are experts in doing qualitative risk analysis. You'll also want to apply. Another tool is to have meetings, particularly things like risk workshops, in which you can introduce or review the probability and impact definitions and matrices that you have, and any preliminary work that you've done to try and assign different risks into these probability and impact assessments. And as you hold these workshops, your goal is to go through all of these different identified risks and to make sure that you have a priority assigned by the time you're done, as well as a risk owner. As you do these workshops and other types of meetings, you'll need interpersonal and team skills, in particular, facilitation skills. And you'll want to keep an eye on risk bias, because some participants and stakeholders will have a bias toward taking more risk and others will be more risk averse. And you'll need to factor that in as you're assessing probability and impact. Another technique that you might use for data gathering includes interviews, one-on-one, or perhaps even small focus groups, in order to learn more information about these identified risks and what their priorities and impact and probabilities are. You'll also be using some data analysis skills. Risk data quality assessment, which is simply an assessment of the quality of the data you have regarding different risks, and whether or not you're using high quality or low quality data and information about risks as you're doing risk assessment. Also, risk probability and impact assessment, which is a key feature of qualitative risk analysis, in which you assess the probability and impact of each risk, and from that derive the priority. Also, you have assessment of any number of other risk parameters. This is an example of a probability impact matrix. Two of them, actually. The one on the left is for threats, or negative risks. The one on the right is for opportunities, or positive risks. On the vertical axes, you have probability, and on the horizontal axis, you have impact. Each risk is assessed to determine its probability of occurring and its impact if it does occur. It's then prioritized according to where each risk's probability and impact meet in this matrix. For example, if a particular risk is assessed as having a medium probability of occurring and a high impact if it does occur, then it's given the risk score of 0.20, which is calculated by multiplying the medium probability score of 0.5 by the high impact score of 0.4. This is just one example of a probability impact matrix. Yours can use different scores for probability and impact assessments. And it doesn't have to be a 5x5 matrix. It could be 4x4, 3x3, or even 2x2. Or you could mix it up and have a 5x4 or a 3x5, or whatever works for your organization and your project. As you determine your impact levels, make sure that you choose objective metrics. For example, you could use the amount of money lost or gained in the case of positive impacts. Low impact could be anything over $1,000. Medium impact could be anything over $10,000, and high impact could be anything over $100,000. The amounts you choose should be tailored to your project. You could also factor in things like health, safety, and environmental impact, but keep the metrics objective and quantifiable. It is, however, a good idea to use percentages for the probabilities and have some sort of impact score to multiply it with to come up with a combined probability impact score. Then you need to decide how many priority levels to have and where to draw the line between them. In this example, you can see that there are 3 priority levels represented by the degree of shading in the cells of this matrix. Low priority for the ones without any shading, medium priority for those with light shading, and high priority for those with darker shading. Hopefully, your organization will already have all of this figured out, and you can just use existing definitions and templates for your probability and impact matrix. If not, be sure to consult with experts in your organization to determine the most appropriate definitions and levels for financial, health, safety, environmental, and other impacts. Probability and impact are the most common factors used to assess priority, but there are other risk parameters that you could use, such as urgency, how quickly you need to respond to this risk, proximity, whether the impact is going to come sooner or later in the project, dormancy, which is about whether or not the impact goes undetected and for how long, manageability, meaning how well you can manage the occurrence or impact of the risk, controllability, which is to the degree to which the risk owner can control the outcome of the risk, detectability, which is about how well you can measure when a risk occurs or when it's about to occur, connectivity, which is how related it is to other risks on your project, strategic impact, which is a measure of how much this impacts your organization's strategic goals, and finally, propinquity, which is the perceived importance by one or more stakeholders. Other tools include risk categorization and data representation. You can categorize these risks however you like. You could organize them by the source of the risk and organize them into a risk breakdown structure. You could categorize them by the area of the project that's affected and connect that to your work breakdown structure. You could categorize them by what phase in which the risk is most likely to have an effect, or the phase that it could have the greatest impact on, or any number of other types of categories. For data representation, you'll probably use a probability and impact matrix, as we have shown. But if you're going to use multiple factors, you may also want to use some multi-dimensional charts to show multiple 3 or 4 different dimensions all in one chart. To summarize, the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process has as its outputs simply updates to the risk register primarily and the risk report, and some changes could be made to the assumption log and issue log as a result. The inputs are just about everything that you have so far, including your risk management plan, your project documents, and enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Your tools and techniques include expert judgment, data gathering, different data analysis techniques, particularly the probability and impact assessment, interpersonal and team skills that you'll use in your meetings, the categorization of risks, and the representation of this analysis using a probability and impact matrix, or if you're using more factors, other hierarchical charts or multidimensional charts. Now we come to the Perform Quantitative Risk Analysis process. This process numerically analyzes the combined effect of multiple individual project risks and other sources of risk on the project and the project objectives. The benefits of this are that it quantifies your overall project risk exposure, and it provides quantitative risk information to support your risk response planning later on. The results of this quantitative risk analysis are added to your risk report, and this is your one and only output of the quantitative risk analysis. Quantitative risk analysis is not required for all of your projects, and it depends on having high quality data to work with. And it's usually going to require some very specialized software and expertise to run that software, and to know how to load it up with data and how to properly analyze this quantitative risk. This is something that you can toy around with a little bit in Excel, but you can't really effectively do that and do this kind of quantitative analysis in Excel. You need something much more powerful than that, because as you assess all of the different risks that could happen and how they can affect each other, and how a change or a risk happening at one point in the project can affect all of the other activities around it or downstream, how it can affect the critical path of your project, resource availability and costs. So many things can be affected by this. There are so many interdependent variables that you really need some specialized software to assess all of this as a whole. Normally, quantitative risk analysis is only going to be done for the most complex and largest of projects that are very strategically important or that are otherwise required as part of your contract, or if you have a key stakeholder that requires that you do quantitative risk analysis. Despite the fact that this is a rather complex and difficult thing to do, it is really the only reliable method to assess the overall project risk and to know how all of these different variables can possibly interact and affect the outcomes of your project. Your inputs to perform qualitative risk analysis are many, starting with the risk register, from which you'll pull the highest priority risks that you've identified from your perform qualitative risk analysis process. Your project management plan, including your risk management plan and all of your different baselines, your estimates, your basis of estimates, forecasts, and all kinds of information that you need to plug into your simulation in order to do this analysis. You'll also want to consult various enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. For tools and techniques, in addition to your standard expert judgment, data gathering, and interpersonal and team skills, you'll need to consider how to represent uncertainty using different probability distributions. You'll need to make sure you pick the right distribution for each risk. And you'll need to identify and represent the proper correlations between different risks that are related. Performing the quantitative risk analysis will involve a data analysis technique of simulation, for example, a Monte Carlo analysis, in which you use a computer to run through thousands of different scenarios of different risks happening, with random inputs within the ranges of your estimates based on your probability distributions, and then you add up all of these different thousands of scenarios and represent them on a histogram to summarize these results. And then you can use some criticality analysis to determine which elements have the greatest effect on your critical path. Once you've run this simulation thousands of times through all of these different random scenarios and determined the overall impact for each of these thousands of test cases, you can then graph this on a histogram, or in this case, on an S-curve that shows the probability that the project will cost, in this case, 2.1 million or 2.2 million or 2.3 million, and so on. And then using these results, you can see in this case that the expected cost is higher than the target cost. But you can also see that there's an 85% chance of the project costing 2.45 million or less. And this gives you a much better picture of what your most likely project costs are going to be. And you can apply this to project schedule or any other project objective. Once you've run thousands of scenarios through this simulator, you can then figure out which project risks have the most impact on your project outcomes. And then you can take those most important project risks and display them on a tornado diagram. Here's an example of a tornado diagram. It shows the activities and risks that are most strongly correlated with the duration of the project. The items with the strongest correlations are listed first, resulting in this characteristic shape like a tornado. Unlike the complex simulations described so far, decision tree analysis is a simple technique for deciding on a course of action, such as which approach to take on a project. The example in this diagram is to decide whether to build a new plant or upgrade the existing plant. For each decision option, you assess the probability and value of different scenarios. In this case, whether market demand will be strong or weak. For each scenario, you calculate what the value would be of that scenario. For example, if you build a new plant at a cost of $120 million and the demand is strong, it will bring in $200 million for a net value of $80 million. However, if the demand is weak, then the net value is a loss of $30 million. You then repeat this for all of the other decision options and scenarios. Then multiply each net value by the probability of its scenario happening, and add them together to calculate the expected monetary value, or EVM, of each decision. This lets you compare the weighted average value of each decision option. Squares, circles, and triangles help to visually distinguish the decision options, scenarios, or chances, and the net values at the end of each branch. An influence diagram is a visual representation of the various relationships between elements of the project, including the influences, effects, ranges, and probabilities of these relationships. It's a way to visualize the kind of data that is used to run quantitative simulations, such as Monte Carlo analysis, the results of which can then be represented using a histogram, an S-curve, or a tornado diagram. And now to review, the results of your quantitative risk analysis are added to your risk report. Inputs come from all over the place, starting with the risk management plan and the project scope, schedule, and cost baselines, plus anywhere you can find information about uncertainty and ranges of estimates. Tools and techniques include expert judgment, interviews, facilitations, representations of uncertainty using probability distributions and correlations, and simulations, sensitivity analysis to determine which elements most affect the project objectives, decision tree analysis, and influence diagrams. And that's it for part 2. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.